Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. My name is Ann Whitmore, 66 years old from Seattle, and one morning I opened my email to find a $53,000 credit card bill. Paris hotels. Tiffany jewelry. First-class tickets all gone in a single day. Then a message from my daughter-in-law lit up my phone. Love the treats, Mom. Paris is amazing. She posed with champagne against the Eiffel Tower, a diamond bracelet glittering on her wrist. That was the moment my heart broke, and the moment I swore she would never take from me again, because soon I would uncover her $75,000 fraud plan to erase everything my husband and I built. The morning light slanted through my kitchen window, falling across the table where I kept my laptop open, and a half-finished cup of coffee sat cooling. I tapped the trackpad to wake the screen, and the first thing that greeted me was an email from my credit card company. The subject line said urgent account activity. My stomach tightened before I even clicked it, a dread I could not explain pulsing through me. When the statement opened, my breath caught. $53,000 charged in a single day. The list scrolled down my screen like a parade of insults. Hotel Ritz Paris, Tiffany and Company, a luxury spa package, airline tickets first class from Seattle to Paris, each number larger than the last, each line item burning my eyes. I pressed my fingers to my temple as if that would steady the world that suddenly tilted. My wallet had been in my purse just yesterday when I ran errands at the grocery store. I remembered tucking it back in after paying. The card should have been safe. I dug into the purse now, almost frantic, and pulled out the worn leather wallet Harold had given me on our 30th anniversary. The card slot was empty. A hollow space stared back at me. My hands shook as I set the wallet down on the table. My throat tightened, a sound half between a sob and a curse trying to escape. I pushed back from the table and stood pacing to the window. Outside, my small backyard looked as it always did, the cedar trees swaying gently, the birdbath glinting in the morning sun, but I could not see beauty in it. I saw betrayal. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text notification lit the screen. Zoe, my daughter-in-law. I grabbed the phone, hope flickering for an instant that maybe she had seen something, maybe she knew, but the message erased that hope with a single line. Love the treats, Mom. Paris is amazing. Attached were photos. I swiped through them with stiff fingers. Zoe posed on a balcony with the Eiffel Tower gleaming behind her, her arm raised in a mock toast. A diamond bracelet glittered on her wrist, catching the sunlight like it belonged in a display case. In another, she lounged in a white hotel robe, a champagne flute in her hand, the city spread out beneath her as if it were her personal kingdom. Her smile was bright, wide, triumphant. Heat surged up my neck. My knees went weak and I sank into the chair at the table, phone still clutched in my palm. This was no mistake. No stolen number by a stranger in a different state. This was my own daughter-in-law using my card like it was her ticket to a life she had not earned, and she was brazen enough to thank me for it as if flaunting her victory. I scrolled back to the email, my eyes blurring. $53,000. More than I had ever spent on myself in a year, maybe two. I had worked my whole life beside Harold to build a stable, life-saving, being careful living within our means. And now Zoe had tossed it away in a single indulgent spree. I thought back to the last Sunday dinner. Zoe had insisted on helping clear the dishes. She had pressed close when she hugged me goodbye. I remembered her hand brushing my purse on the chair by the door. At the time, I had thought nothing of it. I had even felt warmed that she showed me affection. Now my stomach turned at the memory. The kitchen felt suddenly too quiet. I stared at Harold's chair across from me, empty since he passed in 2018, and my heart squeezed. He would have known what to do. He would have stood tall, calm, unshaken. I closed my eyes and breathed, trying to borrow his steadiness. The phone buzzed again. Another text. Zoe again. The suite is incredible. You should see the view from our balcony. More photos, each one sharper than a knife. Jewelry piled on the nightstand. Shopping bags from designer boutiques spilling across the bedspread. Zoe's radiant face centered in every frame. I set the phone down as if it burned. My hands trembled too much to hold it. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I pressed my palms flat on the table, grounding myself. The humiliation pressed down heavier than the financial loss. This was not just theft. It was a mocking reminder that in her eyes, I was nothing but a bank account too weak to fight back. I rose and walked slowly back to the window. The roses Harold had planted lined the fence-red blooms, bending under the morning sun. I had tended them alone for 5 years. I whispered his name, the air catching in my throat. I was not helpless. I would not let Zoe make me small. But still the ache in my chest would not ease. $53,000 gone in a single day. A family I had longed to hold close, now turning into something I could hardly recognize. My son's wife smiling in Paris with my card. And me, standing in my quiet kitchen in Seattle, holding the weight of betrayal heavier than I had ever known. I pushed myself up once more and walked to the sink, running cold water over my wrists. The shock steadied me a little, pulled me out of the spiral. My reflection in the window above the sink looked older, wearier, but behind my tired eyes a spark of anger began to burn. Zoe thought I would do nothing. She believed I would shrug and accept it because I was 66 and alone. She underestimated me. I dried my hands and wandered into the living room. Family photographs lined the mantel. Ty as a boy with scraped knees, Ty in his graduation gown, Ty standing with me at Harold's grave. My heart twisted. Somewhere along the way, that little boy had been pulled away from me, and I knew exactly whose hand had done the pulling. The thought both broke me and stiffened my resolve. Back in the kitchen, the coffee had gone cold bitter on my tongue, but I drank it anyway. I opened the laptop again, scrolling through the statement one more time. $53,000. The numbers did not lie. Each charge was a stone laid in the path I would have to walk. I reached for a notebook, the same one where Harold and I had once tracked every business expense, and I began to write down the charges one by one, my handwriting steadying with each line. By the time I finished the list, the fear that had gripped me earlier had shifted into something else. A determination I had not felt in years. This was not over. Zoe might have taken my card, but she had no idea who she was really up against. I sat there for what felt like an hour, the phone heavy in my hand, the pictures of Zoe still burning behind my eyes. My chest tightened with each breath until finally I pressed the call button on Ty's number. It rang twice before he answered, his voice, distant, muffled, like he was already bracing himself. "Hey, Mom." I could hear movement in the background, maybe a door shutting, maybe Zoe nearby. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to sound steady. "Ty, something's wrong. My credit card has been stolen. There are charges from Paris over $50,000. There was a pause, then a sigh, the kind he gave when he thought I was overreacting. "Mom, Zoe told me you offered to cover this trip. She said you insisted." My stomach dropped as if the floor had fallen away. Offered. Insisted. The words twisted like a blade. "Ty, I never gave anyone permission. Not her. Not you. That card was taken from my wallet." Another pause. In the background, I thought I heard Zoe laugh, light and easy, a sound that only deepened the ache in my chest. Ty spoke again, firmer this time. She showed me the texts. She said you told her to treat herself, that it was your way of celebrating our anniversary. My pulse roared in my ears. Texts. I gripped the counter, the wood digging into my palm. Ty. I did not send any messages. There are no texts from me saying that. She must have... I trailed off the word forged, choking me before it could leave my throat. Mom. His tone softened, almost patronizing. Maybe you forgot. You've had a lot going on. Dr. Lee mentioned stress can affect memory. My throat burned. The suggestion that I had simply forgotten signing away $53,000 made my head spin. Ty, listen to me. I know exactly what I have said. I never gave Zoe my card. I never told her to use it. That money is gone because she took it. Silence spread through the line like a fog. I could picture him standing there, torn between me and her, weighing words that should not have required weighing at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge of irritation. Mom, I don't want to fight about this while we're on our trip. Let's just talk when we get back. Talk when we get back. The words struck like a slap. He was in Paris sipping champagne while I sat in my kitchen staring at the ruins of trust. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. Ty, this is not a misunderstanding. It is theft. Look at the photos she is posting. Do you think souvenirs and a hotel suite cost a few thousand? Check her jewelry box when you get home. His breath hitched faintly on the line, the first crack in the shield Zoe had built around him. He did not answer right away, and in that silence my heart pounded with both grief and a flicker of hope. Then his voice returned quiet, almost pleading. Mom, please. Don't make this harder than it already is. I closed my eyes. For a moment, all I could hear was Harold's voice from years ago telling Ty to always respect me, to trust me, to remember who had raised him. But now my son's loyalty was stretched thin, bending toward a woman who had stolen from me in plain sight. I forced the air out of my lungs and whispered, "You'll see the truth soon enough." I hung up before he could reply. My hand shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone onto the floor. The house pressed in around me, the silence no longer peaceful but suffocating. I leaned against the counter, staring at the faded family calendar still pinned on the fridge. Holidays, birthdays, notes written in my careful script, all reminders of the life I had worked to hold together. I thought of Ty as a boy running into the kitchen with scraped knees, his eyes wet with tears. He had always trusted me, then always reached for me first. I thought of him as a teenager late night studying at this same table, Harold and I cheering him on. And I thought of the man now, his voice heavy with doubt, choosing to believe Zoe's story over mine. The betrayal cut deeper than the missing money. It was the fracture in the bond I had believed unshakable. I moved to the sink again, staring out at the roses along the fence. Harold had planted them with Ty when he was 10, teaching him to dig carefully, to water slowly, to be patient. The blooms had flourished every year since, even after Harold passed. I wondered if Ty remembered that day, the sun on his face, the dirt under his fingernails, his father's hand guiding his. I pressed my fingertips against the cool glass of the window. My son was still there somewhere under the weight of Zoe's influence. He had to be. The thought was the only thing that kept me standing. I walked back to the table and picked up the printed statement again. The numbers no longer blurred. They glared back at me, undeniable cold evidence. Each charge was a piece of truth that Zoe could not hide forever. The kitchen clock ticked in the stillness, each second stretching like a reminder that time would reveal everything. I gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and slid them into a folder. If Ty would not believe me now, he would when I laid the evidence in front of him. The anger inside me sharpened into resolve. I was not just a mother grieving the distance of her son. I was a woman who had built a business, raised a family, and survived loss. And I would not let anyone, not even my own daughter-in-law, strip me of dignity or control. I set the folder on the counter, straightened my shoulders, and inhaled. The line between hurt and determination had been crossed. Zoe thought she had won, but the game had only just begun. I sat in the kitchen long after the call had ended, my phone face down on the counter, as if hiding from the truth might make it disappear. The silence stretched around me thick and heavy, and my mind began circling back through the small moments I had ignored. Zoe brushing past me with a smile too wide, her hand grazing my purse when she reached for the plates. Her cheerful voice saying she would take care of the dishes after Sunday dinner, ushering me into the living room while she lingered behind. I had wanted so badly to believe her kindness was real that I dismissed the prickling unease each time her fingers seemed too close to my belongings. Her words returned to me now, sharp as pins. Little jokes about how I was always misplacing things. Laughs tossed in the air like confetti when she said stress made older people forgetful. I had chuckled along, trying to be easygoing, but each memory sat differently now, like puzzle pieces forming a darker picture. She had been setting the stage, building a story where I was unreliable, where any protest I made could be brushed off as confusion. I pulled a small leather-bound ledger from the drawer beside the fridge, the one Harold and I had used years ago when tracking the last projects for Whitmore Consulting. My hands trembled as I opened it, the paper yellowed at the edges but still crisp. I began flipping through the pages, scanning my own notes. Something caught my eye. An entry from 4 months back. A charge at a spa in downtown Seattle. $1,200. I frowned, pressing a finger against the number. I had not set foot in a spa in years. I kept going. A week later, an $800 dinner at a high-end restaurant on the waterfront. That night, I had been home alone watching an old movie. My chest tightened. I turned more pages. $2,600 at a boutique in Bellevue listed under the account for Whitmore Consulting. I remembered the shock when I first saw the charge online, how I told myself it must have been some auto payment I had forgotten to cancel. But here it was again, staring at me in my own neat handwriting, logged, but never explained. I pushed the ledger aside and went to my desk in the corner of the living room, where I kept a file box of old statements. Dust clung to the lid as I opened it and sorted through envelopes, each one a month of my life neatly stacked. I pulled the most recent 6 months and spread them across the table. One by one, I unfolded them, running my finger down the lists of transactions. The pattern emerged slowly but unmistakably. Restaurants, spas, boutiques, all with charges I never made. None of them had seemed large enough to scream theft, but together they formed a trail, each one leading back to the same card. Not my personal card, but the one tied to Whitmore Consulting LLC, the business Harold and I had built from the ground up. My stomach churned. That account had been left open for final obligations, a small safety net until every loose end was tied. Ty had been added as an authorized user to help me wind things down after Harold died. We had kept it active to cover occasional residual expenses, but these charges were not business. They were indulgences. Designer clothes, fine dining luxury treatments. I pressed my palms against the folder until my knuckles whitened. This was not only about me anymore. Using that card meant falsifying expenses for a company still recognized by the IRS. It meant corporate fraud, not just petty theft. The realization struck with such force that I sank back into the chair, air leaving my lungs in a slow, trembling exhale. I thought of Harold's voice from years ago, steady and commanding, teaching me the importance of keeping clean books. He had always said numbers told the truth when people did not. Now the truth sat spread across my table in black ink and cold figures. I stared at Zoe's smiling face on my phone again, the one from Paris with her hand lifted in a toast. The diamond bracelet on her wrist shimmered in the light, mocking me. That piece alone matched one of the charges. $18,000 at Tiffany's billed to Whitmore Consulting under client entertainment. My mouth went dry. She had not just stolen from me. She had dragged the business Harold and I had created into her game. The betrayal cut in layers. She had stolen my card, mocked me with her messages, poisoned my son's trust, and now she was risking our company's name. The company that had paid for Ty's college, that had built the home he grew up in, that had been Harold's pride. I rose from the table and began pacing the length of the kitchen, my slippers whispering across the tile. I felt the weight of every choice I had made, every moment I had, laughed off her comments every time I had silenced my own instincts in the name of peace. My chest burned with regret. But alongside the regret was something sharper, steadier. A spark of the woman I had been when Harold and I were running contracts with Fortune 500 clients, when I negotiated deals in boardrooms filled with men who had underestimated me. I returned to the table and gathered the statements into a neat pile, tucking them into a folder with the ledger on top. My reflection in the window above the sink caught my eye again. Silver hair pulled back, eyes tired but fierce, jaw set. This was not the face of a woman too weak to fight back. The clock ticked on, steady and patient. I slid the folder into my bag and closed the clasp with a click that sounded louder than it should have. Tomorrow, I would take these documents downtown to the office we had once run. Jen would know what to do. She had handled our accounts for years. If anyone could help me understand the scope of this, it was her. For now, though, I allowed myself a single moment to breathe. I stood at the back door looking at the roses Harold had planted with Ty. The blooms were beginning to fade as autumn crept in petals loosening, ready to fall. I traced one with my fingertip, the softness a reminder of what had once been cared for with love. Then I straightened, letting my hand fall. The ledger, the statements, the jewelry on Zoe's wrist, they all pointed to the same truth. This was no misunderstanding, no simple mistake. This was a calculated plan, and it was bigger than I had dared to imagine. I turned off the kitchen light and let the darkness settle around me, the folder heavy in my bag, the weight of it both a burden and a weapon. In the stillness of my house with Harold's memory close and the roses swaying outside, I knew there was no going back. The next step would take me straight into the heart of the company we had built and into a fight I had no choice but to face. The next morning, I woke with the folder still on the nightstand beside me, as if the weight of it had followed me into my dreams. My sleep had been shallow, broken by flashes of Zoe's bracelet and the long list of numbers that had filled my kitchen table. By sunrise, I knew there was no delaying. I needed clarity, and there was only one place I could get it. I dressed carefully, pulling on a navy blazer I had not worn in years, smoothing the fabric across my shoulders as if it could give me strength. The streets of downtown Seattle were alive with the hum of morning commuters when I parked in front of the glass building where Whitmore Consulting had once thrived. My stomach clenched as I walked inside, memories of Harold and I striding through the lobby together, rushing back so vividly it hurt. Behind the reception desk, Maria looked up from her computer, her eyes widening in surprise. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, her voice warm but hesitant. "It has been a long time." I managed a smile, though my chest felt tight. "Good morning, Maria. I need to look at some records. Is Jen in today?" Maria nodded quickly and picked up the phone. "She will be right down." While I waited, I glanced around the lobby. The leather chairs, the framed photographs of past projects, all of it familiar yet distant like a chapter of my life preserved in amber. I had avoided this building since Harold's funeral, unwilling to face the ghost of what we had built. Now it was not nostalgia that brought me back, but survival. The elevator doors slid open and Jen Morrison stepped out. Her hair pulled back neatly, glasses perched on her nose. She froze when she saw me, then offered a polite but guarded smile. "Anne," she said. "What a surprise." I held up the folder. "I need your help, Jen. It is urgent." She led me into a conference room that smelled faintly of polished wood and coffee. We sat across from each other at the long mahogany table where Harold and I had once celebrated contract wins. My heart pounded as I opened the folder and slid the statements toward her. "I need to understand these charges," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Jen adjusted her glasses and began to read, her eyes scanning each line with practiced precision. She flipped from one statement to the next, her brow furrowing deeper as the pages turned. Finally, she looked up, her expression dark. "Anne, these are not business expenses. They are personal luxury purchases." I nodded, my throat dry. "I did not make them." She tapped one line with her pen. "This spa charge is coded as client entertainment. That boutique expense is listed under professional development. Someone went out of their way to disguise these." My chest tightened. Could it have been a mistake? She shook her head firmly. "Not at this scale. This pattern stretches back at least 8 months. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." I gripped the edge of the table. "How much in total?" She tallied the numbers quickly on her calculator, the faint clicking filling the silence. When she finished, she set it down with a finality that made my stomach drop. 22,000 in addition to what you already saw on the Paris trip. 75,000 altogether. The number hung between us sharp and merciless. $75,000 siphoned from the company Harold and I had poured our lives into. Jen leaned forward, her voice low. "Anne, this is not just theft. This is corporate fraud. If the IRS audits and sees false documentation, the penalties could be severe. And since Ty is an authorized user on the account, they will hold him responsible too, unless he can prove otherwise." The room tilted slightly and I had to steady myself with a deep breath. Ty's name, his career, his future. He had no idea Zoe was doing this, but on paper his signature tied him to every charge. My son could lose everything because of her. I pressed my hands together tightly in my lap, the familiar ache of helplessness creeping back, but I forced it down. "What do we do now?" Jen studied me for a moment, then said carefully, "The company has a duty to report fraud. If we wait too long, it looks like complicity. But before we file anything official, we should gather every shred of evidence. Dates, amounts, receipts if possible. We need a complete picture." I nodded, my throat tight. "I will get you what you need." Her eyes softened slightly. "I know this is personal, Anne, but this is serious." I looked at her, my voice dropping to a whisper. "She thinks I will do nothing. That I am old, confused, too weak to fight." "She is wrong." Jen gave a small, grim smile. "Then let us prove her wrong." We spent the next hour sorting through the charges, marking each one that raised red flags. With every line item, my anger sharpened. Zoe's dinners at expensive restaurants while I ate alone at home. Zoe's shopping sprees disguised as company development. The spa days, the designer accessories, the Paris suite. Each charge was a thread she had pulled from the fabric of my life, unraveling everything Harold and I had built. When the meeting ended, Jen promised to begin compiling a formal report. She would freeze the account immediately to stop any further charges. I thanked her, my voice catching, and gathered the papers back into my folder. As I stepped out into the crisp air of downtown, the sounds of traffic and footsteps around me, I felt both heavy and lighter. Heavy with the knowledge of what Zoe had done, but lighter with the certainty that I was not imagining it, not losing my mind. The numbers did not lie. The fraud was real. I walked slowly to my car, the folder pressed against my chest like a shield. The city stretched around me tall and indifferent, but in my heart something shifted. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt the old fire returning, the resolve of a woman who had once built a company from nothing. The battle was no longer about a stolen card. It was about protecting my son, defending my husband's legacy, and reclaiming the strength Zoe had tried to erase. And as I turned the key in the ignition, I knew the fight had only just begun. I drove home from the office with my mind buzzing, the folder on the passenger seat like a live wire. Every red mark Jen and I had drawn on those statements screamed at me, each charge a reminder of Zoe's arrogance. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the anger had hardened into something sharper. I needed legal advice before I took another step. That afternoon, I called Ross Miller, an attorney I had known for years. He had handled some of Whitmore Consulting's contracts back in the day, and after Harold's passing, he had guided me through probate with quiet patience. His voice on the line was steady, and when I explained I needed to meet about something urgent, he cleared his calendar. The next morning, I parked outside his office, a brick building near Pike Place Market, the smell of the waterfront mixing with the crisp autumn air. Walking inside, I felt like I was stepping into another life, one where Harold and I sat side by side, signing papers and making plans. Now it was just me, clutching a folder that contained the rot festering inside my family. Ross rose from behind his desk when I entered. He was in his late 60s now, silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Anne, he said it is good to see you, though you look troubled. Sit, please." I lowered myself into the chair opposite him and placed the folder on his desk. My hands lingered on the cover for a moment before I slid it across. "I need your help." He opened it, adjusting his glasses, and began to read. For several minutes, the only sounds were the faint hum of the heater and the steady turn of pages. Finally, he looked up, his face grave. "These are company accounts, Anne. Yes, charges disguised as business expenses, Paris Jewelry Spas restaurants. 75,000 in total." His expression tightened. And who had access to this card? "Ty," I whispered. He was added as an authorized user to help close the business. But he did not make these charges. Zoe did. Ross leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "If we pursue this criminally, law enforcement will investigate both Zoe and Ty. On paper, he is just as responsible as she is." My chest ached. That is exactly what I am afraid of. Ty does not see it yet. He believes her lies. Ross steepled his fingers. "The alternative is civil action. You could sue for restitution. That would focus on recovering the funds rather than punishment, though evidence would still matter. With clear proof, Zoe could be ordered to repay every cent." I sat in silence for a long moment, my heart twisting. Criminal charges meant exposing Zoe for what she was, but dragging Ty into the storm with her. Civil action meant keeping it quieter, protecting him, but it would not fully hold her accountable for the fraud. Ross's voice cut gently into my thoughts. "Whatever you decide, you must be prepared. The key is evidence. Dates, receipts, screenshots, anything that ties Zoe directly to the purchases. Without it, her defense will point straight back to Ty." I clenched my hands together in my lap. "I already have some. Photos of her wearing the bracelet, the statements, the messages she sent. But I will get more." Ross studied me, his eyes searching. "You seem different, Anne. Stronger." I met his gaze. I will not let her destroy my son or my husband's legacy. He nodded, closing the folder. Then gather everything you can. Once you are ready, we will discuss the next step. For now, keep this quiet. The less she knows, the more she will expose herself. When I left his office, the sun was low over the water, painting the bay in streaks of orange. The streets bustled with tourists and vendors' laughter floating in the air. I moved through it like a ghost, the folder tucked beneath my arm, my mind already racing ahead. On the drive home, I replayed Ross's words: civil or criminal, protect or punish. Ty's face rose in my memory, the irritation in his voice when he accused me of forgetting. He was caught between loyalty and deception, and if I made the wrong move, he could fall on the wrong side of the law. That I could not allow. By the time I reached my quiet neighborhood, I had made my choice. I would not run to the police just yet. I would build my case in silence, stone by stone, until it was unshakable, and then when Zoe least expected it, I would lay the truth bare. Inside the house, I poured myself a glass of water and carried it to the living room, setting it down beside Harold's photograph on the mantel. His smile in that picture was steady, reassuring. I spoke into the stillness. I will handle this, Harold. I promise. The night stretched long and restless. I spread the statements across the dining table, highlighting charges, matching them with Zoe's social media posts, taking notes in the ledger like I once had for client accounts. Each connection tightened the net around her. A dinner at Canlis lined up with a photo of Zoe posting a gourmet dish the same night. A boutique charge matched a shopping bag she flaunted online. Piece by piece, the web took shape. When I finally pushed back from the table, my eyes aching from the strain, I felt something I had not in years. Control. The fear that had threatened to drown me was receding, replaced by resolve. I carried the stack of documents to my bedroom and set them carefully in the drawer of my nightstand. Then I stood at the window looking out at the roses Harold had planted, their petals catching the faint glow of the porch light. They had survived storms, neglect, years of grief, and still they bloomed. I let the silence fill me, my breath steadying. Tomorrow I would take the next step. Zoe thought she had written the story already, that I was the weak widow fading into the background. But the truth was mine to tell, and I was only just beginning to speak. The morning after my meeting with Ross, I stood at my kitchen counter staring at my keys. Among them was the small brass one Ty had given me 2 years earlier, pressed into my palm on a rainy afternoon. "Just in case you ever need to get in, Mom," he had said, smiling in that hurried way of his. I had barely used it since. Now it lay in my hand like a burden and a weapon all at once. They were still in Paris. Zoe's posts made sure the whole world knew that. Every photo was a reminder of the money she had bled from me, every caption dripping with arrogance. I told myself I was not breaking in. I was safeguarding what was mine, gathering proof that would silence her lies forever. The drive to their house in Bellevue felt longer than usual. My hands clenched the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened, my breath steady but shallow. The street was quiet when I pulled up, lined with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. Their house was modern, angular, all glass and stone. From the outside, it looked perfect. Inside, I knew it was rotting. I slipped the key into the lock, my heart thudding as the door clicked open. The silence inside was immediate, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. I stepped carefully across the polished hardwood floors, every creak sounding louder than it should have. The living room was immaculate, almost staged. Designer furniture, expensive artwork, a wine rack filled with bottles I knew they could not afford. I paused to steady myself before climbing the stairs. My eyes flicked toward the family photos on the wall. Ty and Zoe smiling, her arm looped through his, my presence absent from every frame. Upstairs, their bedroom door opened easily. The space was airy, filled with light even on a cloudy day. The bed was neatly made pillows arranged with care. On the dresser sat a jewelry box so large it looked more like a small chest. I approached it, my pulse quickening, and lifted the lid. Inside, a shimmer of gold and silver greeted me. Necklaces with pearls, diamond earrings, rings stacked in rows. I recognized several pieces immediately from the statements. The Tiffany bracelet Zoe had flaunted in Paris, the pearl necklace from April, the tennis bracelet from May. Each one was a marker of theft, an insult displayed like a trophy. But it was not the jewelry that stopped me cold. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a silk scarf, was a manila folder. On the front, written in Zoe's tidy script, were 2 words that made my breath catch. Fraud plan. My fingers shook as I opened it. The first page was a timeline written in neat bullet points. June, establish pattern of confusion. August, suggest financial advisor. December, POA by Christmas. 18 months full control. The words blurred for a moment as my eyes filled with hot tears. Power of attorney. She had been planning to strip me of control over my own life brick by brick until I was nothing but a puppet. I turned the next page. Printouts of property records for my house in Green Lake highlighted in yellow. Copies of Harold's obituary with his business accomplishments underlined. Internet searches about inheritance laws. Notes on guardianship procedures. It was all here laid out methodically like a business proposal. I pressed my hand over my mouth, forcing myself not to cry out. This was not just greed. This was predation. Zoe had been building a case to declare me incompetent to take everything Harold and I had worked for and eventually to cast me aside. My legs trembled as I pulled my phone from my pocket. One by one, I photographed every page, every note, every highlighted sentence. The shutter clicks echoed in the quiet room, each one a nail in the coffin of Zoe's lies. When I finished, I slid everything back exactly as I had found it, smoothing the scarf over the folder, closing the jewelry box carefully. My breath was shallow as I glanced around the room once more. The neatness, the luxury, the careful staging of a life they could not afford, all of it built on deception. I backed out slowly, pausing at the door to steady myself. Downstairs, I moved quickly, careful not to disturb anything. At the threshold, I turned the lock behind me, stepping into the cool air with the weight of the evidence heavy on my phone. In the car, I sat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm the tremor in my hands. My heart pounded, but underneath the fear was a rising determination. She thought she had crafted a perfect plan. She thought no one would ever see it. But I had. And now, the advantage was mine. I started the engine and drove away, the streets blurring past the windshield. The images of those pages burned in my mind, searing away the last of my hesitation. Zoe had underestimated me. She believed I would stay quiet, too desperate for peace, too afraid of losing my son. But she was wrong. Back home, I uploaded the photos to my computer and backed them up on a flash drive. Then I printed them, spreading the pages across my dining table like puzzle pieces. Each one fit perfectly into the larger picture, a portrait of manipulation so deliberate it made my skin crawl. I stood over the table, arms crossed, and whispered to the empty room. You wanted power of attorney by Christmas. Instead, you are going to get exactly what you deserve. The roses outside the window swayed gently in the wind, the same roses Harold had planted with Ty years ago. I let my eyes linger on them, remembering the patience it took to nurture them into bloom. I would need that patience now. But unlike Zoe, I had something she never understood: time, experience, and the will to fight back. As the sun dipped behind the cedar trees and the house settled into evening silence, I gathered the pages into a neat stack and slid them back into the folder. My next steps would have to be precise. The evidence was mine now, and with it the power had shifted. My hands trembled as I set the folder back into the jewelry chest and slid the drawer closed, but inside me, something had shifted. Zoe's arrogance had been laid bare in her own handwriting, every step of her scheme mapped out with chilling precision. She wanted the world to believe I was slipping, that I was confused and incapable of managing my own affairs. That lie had already poisoned my son's mind once, and if I did not act quickly, it could take root in others. I drove home with the images still vivid in my mind, the words POA by Christmas pulsing like a threat I could not ignore. The city blurred past my windows, but all I could see was Zoe's neat bullet points, her underlined notes about inheritance laws, her calculated path to erasing me. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel, forcing my breath to slow. Then I carried the evidence inside, locking the door behind me, as though Zoe might already be waiting in the shadows. The house felt different that evening, charged with purpose. I spread the photographs across my dining table and studied them one by one. Her handwriting was clear, her intent unmistakable. She had planned to use my age, my grief, and my vulnerability as weapons against me. I thought of every moment she had leaned close with her false sympathy, reminding me in front of Ty that memory could fade, that grief could muddle the mind. It had all been calculated. Every pat on my hand, every sympathetic smile, every public comment about how hard it must be to live alone without Harold. She was not simply cruel. She was strategic. The anger rose hot and fierce, but underneath it was a cold, steady clarity. If she wanted to paint me as unstable, then I would prove beyond any doubt that she was lying. There was only one man who could give me that proof. Dr. Lee had been my physician for 15 years, and he had always been blunt, steady, and honest. If anyone could provide evidence that I was of sound mind, it was him. The next morning, I called his office and explained I needed a full cognitive evaluation. The receptionist hesitated, surprised, but she scheduled me for that afternoon. By the time I sat in the waiting room, the knot in my stomach had eased just slightly. This was not humiliation. It was preparation. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air the same as it always had, and I thought of all the years this office had seen me through. The colds and flus Ty had suffered as a boy, Harold's aching back, even the day we had walked out with the diagnosis that would eventually take him from me. Those walls had seen my family's joys and devastations, and now they would witness my resolve. Dr. Lee greeted me with his usual calm. "Anne, it has been too long. What brings you in today?" I sat down, hands folded tightly in my lap. "I need you to test me. Memory, reasoning, everything." He tilted his head. "You seem fine to me, but I will do the tests if it will give you peace." "May I ask why?" I swallowed, my voice quiet but firm. "Because someone is saying otherwise. They are telling my son that I am confused, that I forget things. I need proof that it is not true." His eyes softened with something like pity, but also respect. "Then let us put it to rest." The test stretched over an hour. He asked me to memorize lists of words to recall them later, to draw a clock face to repeat sequences of numbers to solve small problems, while he distracted me with questions. I poured every ounce of focus into each task, my heart racing, as though my entire life depended on recalling a single word. In many ways, it did. When it was finished, Dr. Lee set down his clipboard and looked at me with a small smile. "Anne, you are sharp as ever. No signs of cognitive decline. Your memory, reasoning, and attention are well within normal range for your age. You are fully capable of managing your affairs." The relief was so intense that I felt my shoulders drop, my chest loosening for the first time in days. "Thank you," I whispered. He studied me, his tone gentle. "You want this in writing?" "Yes." "A report. Signed, dated, official." He nodded. "I will prepare it for you today. You can pick it up tomorrow." As I left his office, the air outside felt crisper, cleaner. The city streets bustled with traffic and chatter, but for the first time since Zoe had stolen from me, I felt in control again. She wanted to convince Ty I was losing my grip. Now I had proof that I was not. That evening, I sat at my table with a cup of tea, spreading out the photographs of her fraud plan beside my notes from the company records. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt the old version of myself stirring, the woman who had co-founded a consulting firm, negotiated with executives, and managed finances down to the last cent. Harold had always said I had a mind built for precision, that my strength was in seeing the big picture and the details all at once. I thought of Zoe's smug smile in those Paris photos, the diamond bracelet catching the light. I imagined her shock when I eventually laid this report on the table, shattering her carefully built narrative. She had expected me to crumble under her manipulation, but instead I was standing taller. The next morning, I picked up the report. The words were printed neatly on letterhead signed by Dr. Lee himself. Cognitive function intact. No evidence of impairment. Capable of managing personal and financial affairs independently. I read the lines 3 times, each one like a nail hammered into the coffin of her lies. I placed the report in a clear sleeve and added it to the folder of evidence. The fraud plan photos, the jewelry pictures, the highlighted credit card statements, and now medical proof. The case was forming undeniable and strong. I stood by the window, the roses Harold had planted swaying in the cool breeze. Their petals were fading with the season, but the roots were strong, steady, unshaken. Just like me. For the first time in years, I felt the same confidence I had in the boardroom, the same certainty I had when Harold and I faced challenges side by side. I lifted the report again and whispered to the empty house. You wanted to convince him I was weak. Instead, this is going to be the document that ends you. The quiet stretched warm around me, not suffocating as it had before, but steady, alive. With every piece of evidence I gathered, with every step I took, the balance of power shifted further into my hands, and I knew with a certainty that steadied my heart that Zoe would never see it coming. Ty's world began to shake before mine did. I heard it in his voice the next day when he called short and strained, asking if I was home. I told him yes, though the unease in his tone made my stomach tighten. When he arrived, he barely set down his jacket before pulling out his phone and showing me the email that had landed in his inbox that morning. It was from his company's human resources department, marked urgent. They wanted him in for a meeting with compliance and his direct manager. The reason was simple yet devastating. His name had appeared on a corporate credit card tied to Whitmore Consulting with what they called questionable transactions. They wanted clarification and documentation. Ty's hands shook as he scrolled through the list attached to the email. Luxury restaurants, boutiques, spas, and of course the Paris hotel. All the charges Jen and I had already flagged. The amounts were circled in red, and at the bottom was a polite but sharp line. Please prepare to explain these expenses at your meeting tomorrow. I asked him if he had any receipts, any business justification. He shook his head and ran a hand through his hair. He said he had been at work those nights or home. He had nothing to show. Zoe had handled their finances. Zoe had the accounts, and now his name was tethered to tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent spending. I told him to sit to breathe. He lowered himself into the chair at my dining table, shoulders hunched like a boy being scolded. He whispered that Zoe swore I had given permission. She told him I wanted them to celebrate their anniversary, that I had insisted. She had even shown him messages to prove it. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice calm. I told him again that I had never given her my card, never told her to use it. The report from Dr. Lee lay on the table, and I slid it toward him. I explained I had gone through a full evaluation because Zoe's lies had to be answered with proof. He read it slowly, eyes scanning every line, and when he finished, he set it down without a word. His silence was heavier than shouting. He stared at the table, then muttered that Zoe had spent half the night reassuring him, telling him I was confused that I was spinning stories because I resented her. She said the messages were real, that she would show him the full thread when her phone synced. He confessed he had gone to bed with a pounding headache. I asked him to remember the truth of those dates. I pointed to the boutique charge in Bellevue, then reminded him of the photos he and Zoe had posted from a wine bar that same weekend. I pointed to the spa bill, then reminded him of the dinner he and I had shared here at the house. He frowned, pulling up his own calendar on his phone. Slowly, the certainty Zoe had fed him began to crack. He whispered that HR would not care about stories. They wanted documents proof. I nodded. That was why I had kept every statement, every photo. I offered him copies, but not the originals. He took them with a hand that trembled. Then his phone buzzed. A text from Zoe lit the screen. "Baby, don't let her get into your head. Remember what we talked about." He stared at the words, then turned the phone face down. He asked me quietly what I intended to do. His eyes were wide, as if bracing for me to say police handcuffs headlines. I told him I was building a case, that there were paths that did not have to destroy him along with her. His shoulders sagged with relief, but his guilt was plain. He admitted he had ignored small things for months. A receipt he had stumbled across in Zoe's email for a Tiffany bracelet purchased with a card ending in the same numbers as the company account. She had told him it was a return, then repurchased with her own card. He had believed her, never asking for proof. I saw the realization sink into him like a stone dropped in deep water. His face tightened, eyes rimmed red. He pressed his palms against the table and whispered that he had been blind. I told him he had been manipulated, and manipulators are skilled. He nodded but did not look at me. The next hour passed with him pacing the length of my kitchen, muttering about his job, about how everything he had worked for could vanish in a single meeting. He said his reputation was everything, that once doubt took root, it could never be erased. I reminded him he had the truth now, and the truth, when placed in front of others with clarity, could cut through the fog of lies. He stopped, then looking at me as if seeing me differently for the first time in years. He asked how I had held it together, how I had not broken under Zoe's cruelty. I smiled faintly and told him strength was not always loud. Sometimes it was the quiet decision to gather evidence, to prepare, to wait for the right moment. When he left that night, he carried the folder of copies under his arm like a lifeline. He hugged me before stepping into the rain, not long, not tight, but real. He whispered that he would call after his meeting. I stood at the window and watched his taillights fade down the street. My house was silent again, but not with the same suffocating loneliness as before. This time the silence held purpose. The cracks in Zoe's story were spreading, and soon they would split wide enough for the truth to pour through. I gathered the originals back into my folder and set it on the mantel beside Harold's photograph. The roses outside swayed in the night wind, stripped now of their summer color, but strong in their roots. I touched the folder and whispered that I was ready for what came next. The late afternoon air carried the first real chill of autumn as I set the table, the heavy pot roast filling the kitchen with its familiar warmth. Ty had always loved it tender beef and carrots simmered in gravy, a recipe I had perfected back when he was a boy. Tonight it was more than a meal. It was a stage, and every dish, every folded napkin was placed with intention. The knock came exactly at 6. Ty stood in the doorway, shoulders tense, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Zoe swept in beside him, radiant in a silk blouse, her diamond bracelet flashing under the porch light. Her smile was sweet, but practiced, and her eyes moved over the house as if measuring its worth. I welcomed them with a calm voice, my hands steady though my heart beat against my ribs. We sat at the table. Ty took his usual seat, Zoe across from me. She complimented the roast as though nothing were wrong, as though she had not gutted my accounts for her Paris fantasy. I served the plates in silence, letting the steam rise and curl between us, waiting until the moment felt thick enough to cut. When the first bites were taken, I set my fork down. I told them both I had been reviewing some financial statements. Zoe's fork paused mid-air, then lowered delicately back to her plate. Her smile never faltered. She asked what kind of statements. Credit card purchases? I said, my voice level. Large ones. Charges that I did not make. Ty shifted in his chair, his eyes flicking to his wife. Zoe reached out and placed her hand over his, her diamond catching the light. She said she thought we had already cleared this up, that I had insisted on treating them to a trip, that it was all a misunderstanding. I slid a stack of papers across the table. Statements from the company account highlighted charges. March, April, May. Restaurants, spas, boutiques. Then the Paris trip. $53,000 in 1 week. Ty leaned forward, scanning the lines, his face draining of color. Zoe gave a soft laugh, calling it an honest mistake, that she must have used the wrong card. I let her words hang in the air before laying down the next piece. Photographs printed from her own social media, her wrist lifted to the sky, jewelry gleaming the same items tied to those charges. Ty's hand trembled as he picked them up. Zoe's smile cracked for the first time, her eyes narrowing. She said I had no right to pry into her personal photos, that this was an invasion. I did not raise my voice. Instead, I placed Dr. Lee's report on top of the pile. Cognitive function intact, no evidence of impairment, fit to manage her own affairs. Ty read it carefully, his lips moving silently as he took in every word. When he finished, he looked at me, and for the first time in months, I saw recognition in his eyes. Zoe's tone sharpened. She said money should not matter when family was involved, that I was sitting on wealth while she and Ty struggled to pay their mortgage, that I should have been more generous instead of hoarding everything alone. It was then I brought out the final folder. I set it gently in the center of the table, its label facing them. Fraud plan. $75,000. Ty's head snapped up. What is that? He asked. I opened it and spread the pages like cards in a game. Her neat timeline, each bullet point precise. Establish confusion. Suggest financial advisor. POA by Christmas. Full control in 18 months. Property records of my house highlighted inheritance notes, copies of Harold's obituary, research on power of attorney procedures. The color drained from Ty's face as he picked up one page after another. His voice cracked when he read the words aloud. POA by Christmas. He slammed the paper down his chair, scraping hard against the floor as he stood. Zoe's mask shattered. She lunged to gather the papers, her voice rising, saying they were just notes, just ideas, nothing serious. Ty cut her off, his voice raw, louder than I had ever heard. He demanded to know if she had been planning to strip his own mother of her rights to take her house, her accounts, everything Harold had left behind. Zoe's voice turned shrill. She shouted that I had plenty, that I would not even notice if some of it was shared, that she had done everything for their future. Ty shouted back that stealing was not sharing, that lying was not love. He pounded the table with his fist, his face twisted with fury. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, letting the storm break. For months I had been silenced by doubt, by grief, by fear of losing my son. Now the truth was laid bare in the very document Zoe had written with her own hand. Ty turned on her, then his voice shaking but clear. He told her she had betrayed him, not just me, that she had turned him against his own mother with lies, that she had made him doubt the woman who had raised him, who had worked to give him everything he had. Zoe tried again, her tone suddenly soft, pleading. She reached for him, tears bright in her eyes, saying she had only wanted a better life for them both. But Ty stepped back, his arms rigid at his sides. His voice dropped to a whisper that still carried more weight than his shouts. "You betrayed me." The silence that followed was heavier than the shouting. The only sound was the ticking of the clock in the hall, steady and relentless. Zoe's hands trembled as she gathered the papers into a messy pile, but Ty shoved them back toward me. I looked at him then, and for the first time since Paris, I saw my son as he once was. The boy who had stood at Harold's grave with tears in his eyes and promised to take care of me. Now that boy was a man standing at the edge of the life he thought he knew, realizing it was built on lies. He lowered himself back into his chair, his head in his hands. Zoe sat frozen, her lips pressed into a hard line, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The pot roast cooled on the table untouched. The confrontation had ended, but the war was far from over. I gathered the folder back into my arms, feeling its weight not as a burden, but as a weapon. Tonight had opened Ty's eyes. The rest would follow. Ty's words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the clock ticking in the hall. Zoe sat frozen, her eyes wide, her lips parted as if she might argue, but no words came. My heart pounded, but I knew this was the moment to strike while the truth was laid bare. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool surface of the dining table. "Zoe," I said, my voice calm but firm, "this ends tonight. You stole $75,000. You lied to my son, to me, and to yourself. Now you have two choices. Make it right, or face the full weight of the law." Her head jerked toward me, her hair falling across her face. She gave a sharp, incredulous laugh that rang hollow in the tense room. "You would not dare," she said. "You would not drag your own son's marriage through court and make it public. The press, your neighbors, everyone would know." I folded my hands steady. "This is not about appearances. It is about accountability. I have the records, the photos, and your own plan in black and white. I will not hesitate to take them to the IRS and the prosecutor's office. If you think you can charm your way out of federal fraud, you are welcome to try." Zoe's face flushed, her voice rising. "That money was nothing to you. You sit in this house alone with all of Harold's legacy while we are drowning in bills. You could have helped us, but instead you hoarded it." Ty slammed his palm against the table, making the glasses rattle. "Do not twist this," he shouted. "Mom has given us more than enough. She paid for our wedding, she welcomed you, she trusted you, and you used that trust to rob her blind." I turned my eyes back to Zoe, refusing to let her distraction take hold. "Here are my terms." I said each word deliberate. "You will return the $75,000. Every cent. You will sign a promissory note agreeing to repay it over 5 years with interest, and you will sign a no-contact agreement. From this moment on, you will stay away from me. No phone calls, no texts, no visits. Zoe's chair screeched against the floor as she pushed back, her hands gripping the edge of the table. That is insane! You cannot erase me from this family. What about holidays? What about the grandchildren we might have someday? You cannot cut me out of Ty's life. Ty's voice was like steel. She is not cutting you out of my life. You did that yourself. Zoe spun toward him, desperation etched into her face. Ty, please. I did it for us. For our future. I just wanted us to have something better. He shook his head, his voice breaking. You wanted better for yourself. At my mother's expense. At mine. I stayed silent for a moment, letting his words land. Then I added the weight she needed to hear. If you refuse Zoe, I will submit everything. The IRS will see the false business expenses. The prosecutors will see the fraud. And because Ty's name is on that account, they will not hesitate to drag him into it too. Is that what you want? She gasped, her face draining of color. You would risk your own son. I straightened my spine. No. You risked him when you used that card. You wrote his name into your scheme the moment you started charging jewelry and hotel suites to a consulting company that barely operates. You risked his future, not me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Zoe's breathing was ragged, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap until it tore. Ty sat rigid, his hands clenched into fists. His silence was not weakness anymore. It was judgment. Zoe's voice softened, suddenly shifting like a chameleon. Anne, please, we can find another way. A smaller repayment, or maybe we call it even for everything you already gave us. You know I never meant harm. I stared at her, feeling the heat of every lie she had spun for years. You meant every step I said quietly. You wrote it all down. Power of attorney by Christmas. Full control in 18 months. You planned to erase me. Ty's head snapped toward her. Is that true? He demanded. Did you actually write that? Zoe's lips trembled. It was just notes. Ideas. Nothing serious. Ty's chair scraped back as he stood looming over her. You wanted to take everything from her. From me. She flinched under his gaze, tears welling in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She reached for him, but he stepped away. I love you, Ty, she whispered. I did it for us. His voice dropped to a whisper too, but it cut sharper than a shout. You betrayed me. I leaned forward one last time, my voice steady as stone. Those are the terms. $75,000 repaid. Promissory note signed. No contact. Otherwise, the law takes over. Zoe sat frozen, her breath shallow, her eyes darting between us. Finally, she whispered, You are asking me to give up everything. I shook my head. I am giving you the only chance you have left. Ty stepped closer to me, his hand brushing the back of my chair, his voice firm. You have until the end of the week, Zoe. Sign the papers or face the consequences. Her tears came harder, streaking her mascara, but they were no longer convincing. They were the tears of someone cornered, trapped by her own choices. I gathered the folder back into my arms, the weight no longer heavy but solid like armor. The meal lay untouched, the pot roast cooling forgotten. The battle had shifted, and for the first time the power was mine. The clock ticked on, marking the moment Zoe realized the game was no longer hers to play. The papers were signed on a damp Wednesday afternoon, the kind of Seattle day when the clouds pressed low and gray against the skyline. Ross Miller's office smelled faintly of leather and old books. Ty and I sat side by side at the long oak table, and Zoe across from us, her posture rigid, her jaw set. Ross slid the promissory note forward, explaining once again the terms she had already heard. $75,000 with interest paid over 5 years. He spoke evenly, each word precise. Zoe's pen scratched her name in hard strokes, as if she could wound the page instead of herself. When it was done, Ross produced the no-contact agreement. Zoe hesitated, her eyes darting to Ty. He didn't meet her gaze. His face was pale but steady, his hand resting flat on the table. She pressed her lips together, signed quickly, and shoved the paper back across the wood. A final document acknowledged her admission of unauthorized use of company funds. Ross slid it into a folder that he promised would remain sealed as long as she kept her end. Zoe stood abruptly, her chair scraping, and left the office without a word. The echo of the door closing felt like a verdict. The fallout began immediately. Within days, parcels arrived at my doorstep. A Tiffany box with the diamond bracelet I had first seen gleaming on her wrist in Paris. A white envelope from a boutique with confirmation of a return. A shoebox filled with designer heels wrapped in crinkled tissue. Each came with paperwork proof of sale or refund. I stacked them neatly in the hall, a monument of reversed indulgence. Some items came back used, no longer pristine, and Ross reminded her that she owed the difference in cash. The first cashier's check arrived by certified mail on the exact deadline signed with her scrawled name. At the same time, Ty moved slowly out of the house he had once called his own. He carried 2 suitcases into my guest room and a cardboard box of files from work. That night over dinner, he told me HR had cleared him. Compliance had reviewed his records and determined he hadn't been complicit. He slid a letter across the table, official and final. His shoulders dropped a little as I read it, relief softening the tension that had carved lines into his face. The community did not stay silent for long. In Seattle, whispers traveled quickly. Friends who had once filled Zoe's living room with champagne flutes and polished laughter stopped returning her calls. At a neighborhood gathering, I overheard 2 women mention her name with lowered voices. One said she couldn't believe Zoe had risked federal charges. The other said she could. When they saw me, they straightened awkwardly and changed the subject. I simply smiled. Social media told its own story. Where Zoe had once posted glittering snapshots of Paris and perfect dinner parties, now there were vague captions about resilience and starting over. The comments beneath grew sparse. One friend wrote, "Stay strong," then never appeared again. Another asked if the rumors were true. Zoe didn't reply. Meanwhile, Ty filed for divorce. He cited irreconcilable differences, nothing more, nothing less. He told me in the kitchen one evening while drying dishes, his voice flat but steady. I asked him if he felt regret. He shook his head and said he felt something closer to freedom. The papers moved quickly. No property battles, no custody fights, only the clean severing of a bond that had already rotted. The returns kept coming. Jewelry, handbags, clothes still scented faintly of expensive perfume. Each one was a reminder not just of theft, but of the arrogance with which Zoe had flaunted them. The luxury sedan disappeared from their driveway, repossessed when payments lapsed. I saw it from my window as the tow truck hooked it, the image sharp against the autumn leaves scattered in the street. Ty's company placed him on a new project downtown, a chance to rebuild. He came home late one evening carrying a small plant in a cheap ceramic pot, a gift from a coworker. He set it on my windowsill beside my basil and smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years. It struck me that Zoe had nearly taken this version of him away forever. There were smaller ripples, too. A neighbor approached me outside the grocery store, lowering her voice to ask if everything was all right. I told her it was now. She nodded, her eyes kind but curious. Another friend sent a card with no message inside, only her name, a quiet show of solidarity. One night, as Ty sat reading at the table, I opened the box of returned receipts and ran my fingers over the pile. Karma had not come with flashing lights or prison doors. It had come in cashier's checks and canceled leases, in friends who drifted away in silence that grew heavier than words. Zoe had destroyed her own standing, her own comfort, her own marriage. All I had done was hold up a mirror. The roses in my yard began to harden for winter, their stems bare but alive. I thought of how Harold used to say pruning was painful but necessary, that growth depended on cutting back what was diseased. Watching Zoe's world unravel was not pleasant, but it was pruning. She had planted poison and reaped thorns. When the second payment arrived, Ross confirmed it had cleared and reminded me to keep every receipt. I placed the check in a folder marked restitution and felt the weight of it settle. Not heavy, solid. Proof that I had reclaimed what was mine without needing a gavel or a badge. Ty joined me later on the porch, a blanket over his shoulders, the night air cool. He said he still dreamed sometimes of the arguments, of Zoe's laughter turning sharp, of the way she had convinced him I was losing my mind. He said he woke drenched in sweat, ashamed he had believed her. I told him grief blinds even the strongest eyes, that I too had wanted to believe her kindness was real. We sat in silence after that, the city lights shimmering beyond the hill. Justice had come in a quieter form than I once imagined. No police at the door, no court dates splashed across headlines. Just signatures on paper dollars returned, a marriage dissolved, and a woman left standing alone. I didn't need her punishment to be louder. It was enough that she had destroyed herself and that I had not let her take us down with her. When I went to bed that night, I opened the window to the cool air and listened to the house breathe. The quiet no longer felt hollow. It felt earned. The new year arrived with rain tapping steady against the windows, and for the first time in years, I felt ready for change. The house Harold and I had built together had served its purpose, but its walls carried too many memories of grief and conflict. By February, I had signed papers and sold it, watching moving trucks carry out furniture I once thought I could never part with. Ty stood beside me on the porch as the last box left his hand firm on my shoulder. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. I moved into a condo near the waterfront, a 10th floor corner unit with wide windows that looked out over Elliott Bay. The space was smaller, simpler, but every detail was mine. Hardwood floors gleamed under soft light, and the sound of gulls carried up from the piers below. I hung only the pictures I wanted, the ones that reminded me of strength, not loss. Harold's photograph remained on the dresser, framed in black wood, but the rest was new. My first night there, I sat on the sofa with a glass of wine and watched the sun drop behind the Olympic Mountains. The water turned gold, then faded into violet shadows. It felt like stepping into a life I had been holding at a distance. Seattle mornings became different in the condo. I walked down to Pike Place Market for fresh flowers, letting their colors brighten the rooms. On Tuesdays, I joined Claire and a group of women at a book club, the kind of gathering I had once convinced myself was not for me. Claire introduced me as her neighbor, not as Ty's mother or Harold's widow. I realized how long I had craved that simple kind of belonging. The conversations ranged from novels to politics to stories of grandchildren. I listened, then I spoke, and my voice sounded steady in a way it had not in years. Ty came often. He had settled into his role at the consulting firm, his reputation intact after the ordeal. His shoulders carried less weight now. Some evenings he brought takeout and we ate by the window watching ferries cross the bay. He told me about new projects at work, about colleagues who respected him. Sometimes he fell quiet, his thoughts drifting, and I knew he was still healing. But his laughter had returned, the easy kind that reached his eyes. Spring arrived and I signed up for a photography class through the community center. I carried my camera to the waterfront, capturing sailboats against a clear sky, gulls frozen mid-flight, the lights of the Ferris wheel reflected in the dark water. The world felt sharper, more vivid. I was no longer moving through it as a shadow of myself. Zoe faded into the background. I heard through acquaintances that she had left Seattle, her name whispered only occasionally in circles she once dominated. Some said she lived in Portland now, others thought California. It did not matter. What mattered was that she no longer touched our lives. The promissory checks still arrived neat and punctual. Each one went into a separate account, not for indulgence, but as a record of the balance restored. One evening in early summer, Ty and I stood on my balcony, the city glowing behind us, the water catching the last streaks of orange. He said he never imagined things could feel this normal again. I told him normal was a gift, not a guarantee. He nodded, his eyes on the horizon, and I saw Harold in him in that moment, the same steady calm that had carried me through so many storms. The condo became not just a place, but a reflection of who I was becoming. I decorated with books and plants, not with things meant to impress. Friends from the book club came by for coffee, their voices filling the rooms with warmth. I no longer felt the sharp loneliness that had pressed down on me in the old house. The silence here was different. It was chosen peaceful, not heavy with absence. Looking back, I saw the arc of my journey. I had been a widow lost in grief, a mother clinging to a fragile connection, a woman nearly erased by someone else's lies. But I had fought not with fists or fury, but with clarity and persistence. I had reclaimed my place, my dignity, and my son. The $75,000 was money, but it was never about the money. It was about respect. It was about refusing to be silenced. One late afternoon, I sat with Ty at the window, the bay stretching wide before us, ferries carving paths across the water. The light shifted warm and golden, and I thought of Harold planting roses in our old yard, of the years I had spent holding on to pain instead of possibility. I realized then that my story had turned. I was no longer just surviving. I was living. And now I want to leave you with a question. If it had been you, would you have turned to the courts, demanded criminal charges, and let the system deliver punishment? Or would you have done what I did, kept it within the family, and carved out justice in your own way? Tell me what you would have chosen, because every story like mine has more than one ending. And I wonder how far yours might go.